as what I'm going to read momentarily is true to the original esoteric intentions of the original ancient Freemasonic tradition. So this is written by the Freemason C.W. Leadbeater. And that is, of course, a pseudonym because he's, the beater of the lead, the metals, the base metals, attempting to turn them into gold. It's an alchemical pseudonym. This is from his essay called Vegetarianism and Occultism. Vegetarianism and Occultism, which was published in 1913 by the Theosophical Publishing House. I'm going to read an excerpt from the earlier part of the essay, and I'm going to skip over the first entire section of the essay, which is all about the 5 sense aspect of vegetarianism, the bodily aspects of it, okay, which I covered last week. And you can read this. It's going to be posted with the podcast as well. I'm going to pick this up in the section where he talks about the occult reasons for being a vegetarian. But first, he defines what occultism is, and it's one of the best definitions of occultism that I've read. He says, Leadbeater says, quote, "How shall we define occultism? The word is derived from the Latin occultus, meaning hidden, so that it is the study of the hidden laws of nature." Occultism is the study of the hidden laws of nature. Since the great laws of nature are in fact working in the invisible world far more than in the visible, occultism involves the acceptance of a much wider view of nature than that which is ordinarily taken. The occultist, then, is a man who studies all the laws of nature that he can reach or of which he can hear. And as a result of his study, he identifies himself with these laws and devotes his life to the service of evolution. And he doesn't mean macrobiological Darwinian evolutionary theory. He's talking about evolution in consciousness, evolution toward the higher life, toward the higher self. Now, going farther in the document to the section called Occult Reasons for Vegetarianism, he says, quote, "Under this heading, also we shall have 2 sets of reasons, those which refer to ourselves and our own development, and those which refer to the great scheme of evolution and our duty toward it, so that once more we may classify them as selfish and unselfish, although at a much higher level than before. I have, I hope, clearly shown in the earlier part of this lecture that there is simply no room for discussion in regard to the question of vegetarianism. The whole of the evidence and of the considerations are entirely on one side, and there is absolutely nothing to be said in opposition to them. This is even more strikingly the case when we come to consider the occult part of our argument. There are some students hovering round the fringes of occultism who are not yet prepared to follow its dictates to the utmost. And when he says dictates, he's not talking about any particular system of occult teachings. He means the dictates of the laws of nature, which are dictates, meaning they're spoken into inherent reality by the Creator himself, and they're not suggestions. They're laws that are dictated by the Word, the energetic underlying intelligence of all creation. That's why they're natural laws. They're inherent, non-man-made, immutable, binding conditions, which we defined when we talked about natural law. So there are some students hovering around the fringes of occultism who are not yet prepared to follow its dictates to the utmost, and therefore do not accept its teaching when it interferes with their personal habits and desires. I'll say that again. People hovering on the fringes of these great teachings, these laws of nature, who are not yet prepared to follow the dictates of the laws of nature, therefore do not accept its teaching when it interferes with their personal habits and desires. Continuing, quote, some such have tried to maintain that the question of food can make little difference from the occult standpoint. But the unanimous verdict of all the great schools of occultism, both ancient and modern, has been definite on this point, and has asserted that for all true progress, purity is necessary, even on the physical plane, and in matters of diet, as well as in far higher matters. In many books and lectures, I have already explained the existence of the different planes of nature and of the vast unseen world all about us. I have also had occasion to refer often to the fact that man has within himself matter belonging to all these higher planes, so that he is furnished with a vehicle corresponding to each of them, through which he can receive impressions, and by means of which he can act. Can these higher bodies of man be in any way affected by the food which enters into the physical body, with which they are so closely connected? Assuredly they can. And for this reason, the physical matter in man is in close touch with the astral and mental matter, so much so that each is to a great extent a counterpart of the other. So he's saying there's really no separation. They're all affected. Each part of the self, each part of the dense, vital, astral bodies, they're all connected. They're all feeding off of each other's energy. What you do to one, you do to all. This is part of the non-separation, the unity aspect of consciousness. We have to stop looking at the physical and spiritual in separate terms, in terms of separateness. They are one. Continuing. There are many types and degrees of density among astral matter. For example, so that it is possible for one man to have an astral body built of coarse and gross particles, while another may have one which is much more delicate and refined. As the astral body is the vehicle of the emotions, passions, and sensations, it follows that the man whose astral body is of the grosser type will be chiefly amenable to the grosser varieties of passion and emotion, whereas the man who has a finer astral body will find its particles more readily its particles more readily vibrate in response to higher and more refined emotions and aspirations. The man, therefore, who builds gross and undesirable matter into his physical body is thereby drawing into his astral body matter of a coarse and unpleasant type as its counterpart. And then I'm interjecting, what do you think will be the result of the behavior of that individual? In most cases. Continuing, quote, we all know that on the physical plane, the effect of overindulgence in dead flesh is to produce a coarse, gross appearance in man. That does not mean that it is only the physical body which is in an unlovely condition. It means also that those parts of the man which are invisible to our ordinary sight, in other words, occulted, the astral and the mental bodies are not in good condition either. Thus, a man who is building himself a gross and impure physical body is building for himself at the same time coarse and unclean astral and mental bodies as well. That is visible at once to the eye of the developed clairvoyant. The man who learns to see these higher vehicles sees at once the effects on the higher bodies produced by impurity in the lower. He sees at once the difference between the man who feeds his physical vehicle with pure food and the man who puts into it this loathsome, decaying flesh. Let us see how this difference will affect the man's evolution. Impure vehicles is the next section. Quote, if it is clear that a man's duty with regard to himself is to develop all his different vehicles as far as possible, in order to make them finished instruments for the use of the soul, there is still there is a still higher stage in which that soul itself is being trained to be a fit instrument in the hands of the deity, a perfect channel for divine grace. But the first step towards this high aim is that the soul itself shall learn thoroughly to control the lower bodies, so that there shall be in them no thought or feeling except those which the soul allows. All these vehicles, therefore, should be in the highest possible condition of efficiency. All should be pure and clean and free from taint. And it is obvious that this can never be so long as the man absorbs into the physical encasement such undesirable constituents. So he's saying garbage in, garbage out. It's very simple. You put that which is of a lower vibratory energy in, you're going to have a lower vibratory energy be built as a result. These are the building materials, not only for the physical vehicle, but for the spiritual vehicles as well. Continuing, quote, even the physical body and its sense perceptions can never be at their best unless the food is pure. Anyone who adopts vegetarian diet will speedily begin to notice that his sense of taste or smell is far keener than it was when he fed upon flesh, and that he is now able to discern a delicate difference of flavors in foods which before he had thought of as tasteless, such as rice or wheat. The same thing is true to a still greater extent with regard to the higher bodies. Their senses cannot be clear if impure or coarse matter is drawn into them. Anything of this nature clogs and dulls them so that it becomes more difficult for the soul to use them. This is a fact which has always been recognized by the student of occultism. You will find that all those who in ancient days entered upon the mysteries were men of utmost purity and of course invariably vegetarian. Carnivorous diet is fatal to anything like real development, and those who adopt it are throwing serious and unnecessary difficulties in their own way. Leadbeater here is making the contention. He's actually claiming that those who studied and partook of the ancient mysteries were in fact almost invariably vegetarian. Continuing, quote, I am well aware that there are other and still higher considerations which are of greater weight than anything upon the physical plane, and that the purity of the heart and soul is more important than that of the body. Yet there is surely no reason why we should not have both. Indeed, the one suggests the other, and the higher should include the lower. There are quite enough difficulties in the way of self-control and self-development. It is surely worse than foolish to go out of our way and add another and very considerable one to the list. Although it is true that a pure heart will do more for us than a pure body, yet the latter can certainly do a great deal. And we are, none of us, so far advanced along the road towards spirituality that we can afford to neglect the great advantage that it gives us. Anything that makes our path harder than it need be is emphatically something to be avoided. In all cases, this flesh food undoubtedly makes the physical body a worse instrument and puts difficulties in the way of the soul by intensifying all the undesirable elements and passions belonging to these lower planes. Nor is this serious effect during physical life the only one which we have to think. If through inducing loathsome impurities into the physical body, the man builds himself a coarse and unclean astral body, we have to remember that it is in this degraded vehicle that he will have to spend the first part of his life after death. Because of the gross matter which he has built into it, all sorts of undesirable entities will be drawn into association with him and will make his vehicles their home and find a ready response within him to their lower passions. It is not only that his animal passions are more easily stirred here on earth, but in addition to this, he will suffer acutely from the working out of these desires after death. Here again, looked at even from the selfish point of view, we see that occult considerations confirm the straightforward common sense of the arguments on the physical plane. The higher sight, when brought to bear upon this problem, shows us still more vividly how undesirable the devouring of flesh, since it intensifies within us that from which we most need to be free. And therefore, from the point of view of progress, that habit is a thing that can be cast out once and forever. Man's duty toward nature. Then there is the far more important unselfish side of the question, that of man's duty toward nature. Every religion has taught that man should put himself always on the side of the will of God in the world, on the side of good against evil, of evolution as against retrogression. The man who ranges himself on the side of evolution realizes the wickedness of destroying life, for he knows that just as he is here in this physical body, in order that he may learn the lessons of this plane, so is the animal occupying his body for the same reason, that through it he may gain experience at his lower stage. He knows that the life behind the animal is the divine life, and that all life in the world is divine. The animals, therefore, are truly our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers. And we can have no sort of right to take their lives for the gratification of our perverted tastes, no right to cause them untold agony and suffering merely to satisfy our degraded and detestable lusts. We have brought things to such pass with our miscalled sport and our wholesale slaughterings, that all wild creatures fly from the sight of us. Does that seem like the universal brotherhood of God's creatures? Is that your idea of the golden age of worldwide kindliness that is to come? A condition when every living thing flees from the face of man because of his murderous instincts? There is an influence flowing back upon us from all this, an effect which you can hardly realize unless you are able to see how it looks when regarded with the sight of the higher plane. Every one of these creatures which you so ruthlessly murder in this way has its own thoughts and feelings in regard to all of this. It has horror, pain, and indignation, and an intense but unexpressed feeling of the hideous injustice of it all. The whole atmosphere about us is full of it. Twice lately I have heard from psychic people that they felt the awful aura or surroundings of Chicago, even many miles away from it. Miss Besant herself told me of the same things years ago in England, that long before she came in sight of Chicago, she felt the horror of it and the deadly pall of depression descending upon her, and asked, "Where are we? And what is the reason that there should be this terrible feeling in the air?" To sense the effect as clearly as this is beyond the reach of the person who is not developed. But though all the inhabitants may not be directly conscious of it and recognize it as Mrs. Besant did, they may be sure that they are suffering from it unconsciously, and that terrible vibration of horror and fear and injustice is acting upon every one of them, though they know it not. The feelings of nervousness and profound depression which are so common there are largely due to that awful influence which spreads over the city like a plague cloud. I do not know how many thousands of creatures are killed every day, but the number is very large. Remember that every one of these creatures is a definite entity, not a permanent reincarnating entity like yours or mine, but still an entity which has a life upon the astral plane and persists there for a considerable time. Remember that every one of these remains to pour out his feeling of indignation and horror at all the injustice and torment which has been inflicted upon him. Remember for yourself that the terrible atmosphere which exists about those slaughterhouses. Remember that a clairvoyant can see the vast host of animal souls, that he knows how strong are their feelings of horror and resentment, and how those recoil at all the points upon the human race, at all points upon the human race. They react most of all upon those who are at least able to resist them, upon the children who are more delicate and sensitive than the hardened adult. That city is a terrible place in which to bring up children, a place where the whole atmosphere, both physical and psychic, is charged with fumes of blood and with all that that means. So Leadbeater is saying here The morphogenic field is poisoned. The field of consciousness and energy that we all live in is poisoned as a result of this practice of carnism. And I made reference to that last week and will again in image number 12 on the slideshow. Look at the images and ask yourself the question, what is this practice doing energetically to the field of consciousness in which we are all living? I'm going to pause the reading here to go to a slide number 16 and just have people take a look at what's being said so far in this occult dynamic, the higher hidden dynamic, which is really what we need to understand what we're doing not only to these beings but to everyone, to ourselves, to the entire species, to other species most of all, okay? But we need to understand the self-inflicted effects through the laws of correspondence, the higher laws of nature, the laws that ultimately govern the consequences of our behavior. I showed this slide last week, but with no explanation. It was two small fish being eaten or pursued to be eaten by a larger fish, and then that fish ultimately being pursued to be consumed by an even larger fish. People will look at this thing, at this scenario, and they will say, well, that's the natural order. Everything eats everything else. This form of life eats that life, and then that life eats the life below it. And a life above it eats it. And this is a completely erroneous worldview when it comes to what the natural order actually is. This has nothing to do with the, quote, natural order. So I put on this slide, this scene does not depict the, quote, natural order. The natural order is that everything does not eat everything else. That is not what the natural order is. What this scene depicts is chaos, not order. Chaos is depicted in the scene where everything eats everything else, and then is eaten by things above it that have its same level of consciousness, of low consciousness. This is not what the creation has intended for its creations. The Creator has not intended this for all of its creations to suffer in an eternal prison of eating and being eaten. This is a choice that is created by a belief system. That's what this picture is depicting. It depicts the chaos that we have chosen and created for ourselves through our false belief systems, or in other words, religions, of which carnism is one of the biggest on earth, along with the other false organized religions, along with the religion of authority, and ultimately the religion of money, which drives everything. All of our other negative belief systems largely driven by that belief, by that religion. That's the religion of the New World Order, as I called it, is the god of money. The middle fish in this depiction is humanity. That is the middle fish, the one that's eating the smaller fish below it, but being eaten by the big fish above it. That's us, folks. Whether you realize it, recognize it, want it to be true or not, that's us. Not because that's the natural order. That's where we've put ourselves. That's the condition we have created for ourselves by ignoring the laws of creation. And in that ignorance, we're creating this condition. This is not the universal natural order, the way it must be, the way it always has been and forever shall be. That's an erroneous worldview that is not based in truth at all. The fact of the matter is, this is what the human condition has become because of our attachments to religion, to false religious beliefs, to false belief systems in general. So this is what humanity has become like, and this is what humanity will be like for as long as we continue to engage in such fundamentally flawed ideologies like carnism and many others. That attachment is what is going to keep us in that position, and that is what the law of correspondence dictates, that as we do, so shall be done unto us. So if you want to be free, you have to allow other beings to be free. As long as you enslave and consume other beings, you will be enslaved and consumed. That is the law of creation. You just don't want to acknowledge it. You just don't want to admit that's how it is. You don't want to admit that that's the reason why you're in the prison that you're in. The My Freedom movement doesn't want to acknowledge that. It wants to say, I can have things both ways. I can still be a dominator. I can still be involved in the process of murder and domination over other beings. And somehow, magically, I can still have my freedom bestowed upon me. And it doesn't work that way, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't work that way. Understand the laws of correspondence and causality. We're creating this prison for ourselves by our attachments to false belief systems. We break those false belief systems, we can step out of that chain. Again, this never-ending chain is all about the chain of obedience and attachment to falsity, to lies. We step outside of that attachment, we would be that fish stepping outside of that chain, no longer being a part of it, saying no. Saying no. And that's what it's going to take, that level of will, that level of care, that level of intelligence. Bringing all three of those aspects into harmony, into unison with each other, and engaging them. Now, next week I'll wrap up the reading, the end of the reading of Leadbeater, but it will also be posted to the website. I think it bears finishing the last two sections where I paused just to finish it. But I want to basically wrap up with a phenomenal quote. This is in image number 17 by Gandhi, image number 17 in the slideshow. Gandhi said that a nation's moral progress can be judged by the way it treats its animals. So I started reading from the essay Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater last week. And I didn't get quite to finish that. We were talking about the occult reasons for ceasing the practice of carnism. And I want to finish that reading because we got into the second section where he started transitioning away from, some of the occult reasons we shouldn't do this for our own benefit. But there are also occult reasons, meaning hidden reasons, reasons based upon hidden knowledge, the knowledge of hidden laws of nature, which is what this show is all about. The laws of behavioral consequence, as I call them, or simply natural law, cosmic spiritual law, universal spiritual law is what we're talking about. Again, it needs to be clarified because when you use the term natural, that has a totally hijacked connotation in most people's minds because they've been hammered from their birth with this concept of Darwinism relating to the natural order when it has no such bearing. It has no such connection. So I want to continue reading this document to the end of it. This is Vegetarianism and Occultism by C.W. Leadbeater. We're near the end of the document. I want to pick up from the section called Man's Duty Toward Nature. Then I'm going to read the sections Ghastly Unseen Results and The Better Time to Come. So, quote, "Then there is the far more important unselfish side of the question, that of man's duty toward nature. Every religion has taught that man should put himself always on the side of the will of God in this world, on the side of good against evil, of evolution against retrogression. The man who changes himself on the side of evolution realizes the wickedness of destroying life. For he knows that, just as he is here in this physical body, in order that he may learn the lessons of this plane, so is the animal occupying his body for the same reason, that through it he may gain experience at his lower stage. He knows that the life behind the animal is the divine life, that all life in this world is divine, that animals therefore are truly our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers, and we can have no sort of right to take their lives for the gratification of our perverted tastes, no right to cause them untold agony and suffering merely to satisfy our degraded and detestable lusts. Very strong words there by Leadbeater, and I concur. It is our greed, our selfish interest, our attachment that makes us continue this practice. There is no other need for it. It is not a necessity, as we covered 2 weeks ago. We absolutely destroyed the normal, natural, necessary argument right here on this show and gave tons of supportive evidence to that fact. Continuing to quote Leadbeater, quote, "We have brought things to such a pass with our miscalled, quote, sport and our wholesale slaughterings that all wild creatures fly from the sight of us. Does that seem like the universal brotherhood of God's creatures? Is that your idea of the golden age of worldwide kindliness that is to come? A condition when every living thing flies from the face of man because of his murderous instincts? There is an influence flowing back upon us from all this, an effect which you can hardly realize unless you are able to see how it looks when regarded with the sight of the higher plane, the occult plane, in other words, the unseen, the difficult to see." Continuing, "Every one of these creatures which you so ruthlessly murder in this way has its own thoughts and feelings with regard to all this. It has horror, pain, and indignation, and an intense but unexpressed feeling of the hideous injustice of it all. The whole atmosphere about us is full of it. Twice lately I have heard from psychic people that they felt the awful aura of the surroundings of Chicago, even when many miles away from it. Mrs. Besant herself told me the same thing years ago in England, that long before she came in the sight of Chicago, she felt the horror of it and the deadly pall of depression descending upon her, and asked, 'Where are we? And what is the reason that there should be this terrible feeling in the air?' To sense this effect as clearly as this is beyond the reach of the person who is not developed. But though all the inhabitants may not be directly conscious of it and recognize it as Mrs. Besant did, they may be sure that they are suffering from it unconsciously, and that the terrible vibration of horror and fear and injustice is acting upon every one of them, even though they do not know it. In other words, our practices toward animals are affecting the field of consciousness, the interconnected field of energy in which we all are living. We're not separate from that vibratory, energetic field. And whether we're conscious of it or unconscious of it, it is having an effect upon our wellness, upon our well-being, and ultimately upon the conditions that we are living with, that we are living in, that are affecting us every day on a day-to-day basis. We're part of that dynamic. We are driving that dynamic through our behavior. The next section is called Ghastly Unseen Results. Quote, "The feeling of nervousness and profound depression which are so common there are largely due to that awful influence which spreads over the city like a plague cloud. I do not know how many thousands of creatures are killed every day, but the number is very large. Remember that every one of these creatures is a definite entity, not a permanent reincarnating individuality like yours or mine, but still an entity which has its life upon the astral plane and persists there for a considerable time. Remember that every one of these remains to pour out his feelings of indignation and horror at the injustice and torment which has been inflicted upon him. Realize for yourself the terrible atmosphere which exists about those slaughterhouses, Remember that a clairvoyant can see the vast hosts of animal souls, that he knows how strong are their feelings of horror and resentment, and how these recoil at all points upon the human race. They react most of all upon those who are least able to resist them, upon the children who are more delicate and sensitive than the hardened adult. That city is a terrible place in which to bring up children, a place where the whole atmosphere, both physical and psychic, is charged with fumes of blood and with all that that means. And Leadbeater is talking about the city of Chicago back at the turn of the century, which was the biggest meat production facility in the entire country and probably still is. Continuing, quote, I read an article only the other day in which it was explained that the nauseating stench which rises from those Chicago slaughterhouses and settles like a fatal miasma over the city is by no means the most deadly influence that comes up from that Christian hell for animals, though it is the breath of certain death to many a mother's darling. The slaughterhouses make not only a pest hole for the bodies of children, but for their souls as well. Not only are the children employed in the most revolting and cruel work, but the whole trend of their thoughts is directed toward killing. Occasionally one is found too sensitive to endure the sights and sounds of that ceaseless, awful battle between man's cruel lust and the inalienable right of every creature to its own life. It's all about the principle of ownership, folks. Don't take what you don't own. It's not your life to take from that animal. It is their life. They own their life. That is their right, as Leadbeater says. The right, the inalienable right of every creature to its own life. I read how one boy, continuing to quote, I read how one boy, from whom a minister had secured a place in the slaughterhouse, returned home day after day, pale and sick and unable to eat or sleep. And again, I guess this is even before some, child labor laws, and these children were put to work in these slaughterhouses back then. It's horrific. Continuing, he was day after day, pale and sick, unable to eat or sleep, and finally came to that minister of the gospel, of the compassionate Christ, and told him that he was willing to starve if necessary, but that he could not wade in blood another day. The horrors of the slaughter had so affected him that he could no longer sleep. Yet this is what many a boy is doing and seeing from day to day until he becomes hardened to the taking of life. And then someday, instead of cutting the throat of a lamb or a pig, he kills a man. And straightway we turn our lust for slaughter upon him and think that we have done justice. I read that a young woman who does much philanthropic work in the neighborhood of these pest houses declares that what most impresses her about the children is that they seem to have no games except games of killing. That they have no conception of any relation to animals except the relation of the slaughterer to the victim. This is the education which so-called Christians are giving to the children of the slaughterhouse, a daily education in murder. And then they express surprise at the number and brutality of the murders in that district. Yet your Christian public goes on serenely saying its prayers and singing its psalms and listening to its sermons, as if no such outrages were being perpetrated against God's children in that sinkhole of pestilence and crime. Surely the habit of eating dead flesh has produced a moral apathy among us. A moral apathy among us. Are you doing well, do you think, in rearing your future citizens among surroundings of such utter brutality as this? Even on the physical plane, this is a terribly serious matter, and from the occult point of view, it is unfortunately far more serious still. For the occultist sees the psychic results of all this, sees how these forces are acting upon the people, and how they intensify brutality and unscrupulousness. He sees what a center of vice and crime you have created, and how from it the infection is gradually spreading until it affects the whole country and even the whole of what is called civilized humanity. And I'll jump in there and say exactly. This is affecting the entire morphic field of consciousness that we are a part of. You engage in these practices, they do not stay where they are at. And just because you try to hide them and erect huge walls and fences, that doesn't mean that that energy isn't going beyond that area just because people aren't seeing it. If you want to really see what these practices are, and I guarantee you what you're even seeing there is not even the worst of it by any stretch of the imagination, watch the movie Earthlings. Watch it all the way through. Try to watch it through without looking away from the screen. And I'll bet you can't even do it. Most people don't have the stomach to do it. I congratulate someone who has the stomach to even sit through the entire thing. You have a strong constitution. And it should affect you negatively. That's what it's designed to do. And it's doing a good job of it, that documentary. It should make you feel sick. Because that's the energy we're all taking in as a result of these practices. And you think that that's going to build a good body and brain? Please. Continuing with the document. Quote, "The world is being affected by it in many ways, which most people do not in the least realize. There are constant feelings of causeless terror in the air. Many of your children are unnecessarily and inexplicably afraid. They feel terror of they know not what, terror of the dark, or when they are alone for a few moments. Strong forces are playing about us for which you cannot account. And you do not realize that this all comes from the fact that the whole atmosphere is charged with the hostility of these murdered creatures. The stages of evolution are closely interrelated, and you cannot do wholesale murder in this way upon your younger brothers without feeling the effect terribly among your own innocent children. Surely a better time shall come, when we shall be free from this horrible blot upon our civilization, this awful reproach upon our compassion and our sympathy. And when that comes, we shall find presently that there will be a vast improvement in these matters, and by degrees we shall all rise to a higher level and be freed from all these instinctive terrors and hatreds. The better time to come. We might all be freed from it very soon if men and women would only think. For the average man is not, after all, a brute, but means to be kind if he only knew how. He does not think. Let me repeat that again. He does not think. He goes on from day to day and does not realize that he is taking part all the time in an awful crime. But facts are facts, and there is no escape from them. Everyone who is partaking of this abomination is helping to make this appalling thing a possibility, and undoubtedly shares the responsibility for it. You know that this is so. You know that this is so. And you can see what a terrible thing it is, but you will say, what can we do to improve matters? We who are only tiny units in this mighty seething mass of humanity. It is only by units rising above the rest and becoming more civilized that we shall finally arrive at a higher civilization of the race as a whole. Let me read that sentence again, folks, because that's probably the most important sentence in this essay. It is only by units rising above the rest and becoming more civilized that we shall finally arrive at a higher civilization of the race as a whole. The quantum effect that I've been talking about, that many people have been talking about. It doesn't matter if you don't perceive that a lot of other people are doing it. Eventually, as individual units change themselves, a quantum effect will be built up as that amount rises, and it will eventually spill over to the whole. It is about numbers, but we need to get to that critical mass number when this becomes common sense knowledge. Our consciousness being elevated by desisting in such murderous practices, just lifting our own consciousness up, will be an influence in the whole field of consciousness for the totality of the all. Continuing, the quote, "There is a golden age to come, not only for man, but for the lower kingdoms. A time when humanity will realize its duty to its younger brothers, not to destroy them, but to help them and train them, so that we may receive from them not terror and hatred, but love and devotion, and friendship, and reasonable cooperation. A time will come when all the forces of nature shall be intelligently working together towards the final end, not with constant suspicion and hostility, but with universal recognition of that brotherhood which is ours, because we are all children of the same Almighty Father. Let us at least make the experiment. Let us free ourselves from complicity in these awful crimes. Let us set ourselves to try." That's like that. I called that on the show, breaking in just for a moment. I called that phrase on the show on Rosicrucianism that I did with Bob from Cincinnati on Occult Empire. That's the ultimate Rosicrucian commandment. Try. We must try to improve ourselves. Engage the will to make ourselves better than we were the day before. If we're doing that, no one can fault us. Let us, continuing, quote, "Let us set ourselves to try, each in our own small circle, to bring nearer that bright time of peace and love which is the dream and the earnest desire of every true-hearted and thinking man. At least we ought surely to be willing to do a small thing as this, so small a thing as this, to help the world onward toward that glorious future. We ought to make ourselves pure, our thoughts and our actions, as well as our food, so that by example, as well as by precept, we may be doing all that in us lies to spread the gospel of love and compassion, to put an end to the reign of brutality and terror, and to bring nearer the dawn of the great kingdom of righteousness and love, when the will of our Father shall be done upon the earth as it is in heaven." And I mean, that is just so profoundly powerful that I think it just speaks for itself and nothing else really needs to be. And that's why things like this are considered controversial. What we really are saying is we're face to face with something that is telling us we must change, and that creates discomfort in us because ultimately we don't want to change. We want to stay where we are. We want to stay in our comfort zone. So that's what this issue is ultimately all about. Evolution always must take us out of our comfort zone and into unknown territories. So it is always controversial when proposing behavioral changes to people who have simply done these things in an unconscious state of mind their entire lives and been taught that it is okay and that there are justifications for these practices. We defined carnism last week as a dogmatic religion, moving on to slide number 9 now, as a dogmatic religion based entirely upon violence. Based entirely upon violence. The main belief system of which is that it is morally justifiable and or necessary to kill animals and eat their dead flesh. I called carnism last week in no uncertain terms the ultimate expression of domination. The ultimate expression of domination. We blew apart, as I said, the normal, natural, necessary argument last week. This argument, I've said, is provably false. Immoral meat industry propaganda. It is not normal, it is not natural, and it is not necessary. And we looked at those provably false arguments last week. We talked about the numbers of lives extinguished needlessly in the animal population just last year alone. 10 billion land animals in 2011 alone slaughtered for their flesh. If aquatic animals, water-based animals, are taken into consideration, that number in the United States alone, in the last year alone, totaled over 65 billion, with a B, lives extinguished. Worldwide figures were over double that number, and places the total number of animal deaths at the hands of human beings in the year 2011 alone at well over 150 billion animals. That is 21 times the population, the human population of this planet. This week we're going to start in with looking at justifications for the continuation of this practice, and we're going to look at them one by one. And really, there's many more justifications than just the number I'm going to list here, but I want to focus on 6 major justifications for the continuation of the immoral practice of carnism. It is a religion, as I've said. It's not just an ideology and a practice. It's a religious belief system. It is based on things that are not grounded or rooted in fundamental principles of truth. Therefore, it is a religion. A religion is defined by the root word relegare in Latin, which means to tie back, to hold back, or to thwart from forward progress. That is what the word relegare means, to thwart from forward progress by tying or binding. Religion is binding. We've talked about this before on the show. Religion can also have an alternative meaning of reuniting or reconnecting to something, and that something being truth, being the universal spiritual laws of creation, the universal laws of consciousness, if you will. And that's what we need to retie ourselves to, reconnect ourselves to, reunite ourselves with. That is true religion. But in the sense of religion being used in this world, organized religion and false ideological belief systems, religion is a binding practice that holds us back, that thwarts us from forward evolutionary progress in consciousness. So that is the sense I'm using the word religion in, the connotation I'm using it in. And we talked about what justifications are. Justifications are, we could also look at the root word of justification. It comes from the Latin jus, meaning right or law, and the Latin verb facio facere, which means to make or to create. So when we put these together, justification, it means to create a right, to make up a right that does not exist, to make a right out of a wrong, to imagine to oneself and to try to tell oneself that a wrong is a right. That's what justification or justifying something is doing. It is trying to make a right out of something that is wrong, morally wrong. And justifications really hold no weight. They hold no water. They are something that, they're lies that we tell to ourselves. That's really what a justification is. Justifications are lies that we tell to ourselves about what we may be doing, what we are allowed to do, that actually causes harm to other living beings. There's no such thing. If it causes harm to other living beings, you shouldn't be engaging in that practice. So justifications means the creation of rights that do not exist. And I put the slide number 13 with alien beings, seemingly comical slide, until you really think about it and you understand this is exactly what humanity is. For anybody who's truly aware, you realize humanity is food. By our own choice, by our own ignorance, through our own ignorance, we are food. I mean, you want to really know what the purpose of the prison planet is? It's to make you food. That's what the purpose of it is. In very simple, easy to understand language. If you want to really know what the end goal is, it's you being eaten. And you can look at that in physical terms if you really want to look at it that way. I have no problem with you even looking at it that way. But you're being spiritually devoured. The essence of you is being devoured by the dark forces that currently are in control of this planet. And you're being used as a fuel source for them. You're being eaten by them, by those forces, by those entities, if you will. So this is an ostensibly comical piece of social commentary here in slide number 13. But if you want my opinion, it's literally true. It's quite literally the case. And these aliens have a human being on their dinner table with an apple stuffed in his mouth and all trimmings around him like a Thanksgiving dinner, like a turkey on a table during a Thanksgiving dinner. And they're all making individual justifications. The 6 aliens who are seated around the dinner table, around the dead human being, are all making justifications for why they feel that it's okay for them to continue the practice of slaughtering human beings and using them as their food. So we'll cover these one by one, and I'll talk about what these arguments really are. These justifications for carnism, which I list on slide number 15. Slide number 14 is simply the etymological definition of justification. So, slide 15 shows these justifications for the practice of carnism. And the first is what I call the apathy and ignorance justification. The we don't really care about them. They're them, we're us. We don't care about what happens to them. We can't care about what happens to them. We have too many other concerns, don't you know? You know, after all, they have nothing to do with us. They're different and separate from us. What happens to them is their own lot in life. We got to worry about what happens to us. The apathy, I don't care about their suffering, and ignorance, if I don't pay attention to it or look at it, it doesn't really affect me. The ignorance justification, I should call it, and start using that inflection when using that word. Ignorance, because that's what it really is it's ignoring the injustice. It's ignoring the suffering. The quote that backs this justification up is, we have our own problems. We don't have time to worry about whether they suffer or not. So that's the apathy and ignorance justification. And if you want to remain apathetic and ignorant, you know what invariably ends up happening. Enslavement. You can't have freedom without care and intelligence. And if you want to ignore things, you don't want to pay attention, you don't want to acknowledge and admit to what's really going on, you're going to end up enslaved. If you don't care, you're going to end up enslaved. If you want to remain apathetic, you're going to end up enslaved. That's how the laws of nature actually do work. The second argument, oh, they kill other animals for food. Why shouldn't we do the same? Well, we see this happening in quote-unquote nature. You know, we see animals being carnivores and killing other animals for their food. Why shouldn't we do the same? Why shouldn't we just act as other beasts of the field? It seems like that's the natural order, right? Well, I call this the fundamentally flawed idea of the quote-unquote natural order justification. This involves an erroneous perception of what nature's laws actually are. And it's based on Darwinian evolutionary theory, Darwinian macrobiological evolutionary theory, which there is no scientific evidence to support. And people will horrifically react to that statement. But go look in the actual fossil record and look at all of the mental gymnastics that is done to prop up this theory of macrobiological Darwinian evolution. Darwin himself didn't believe in this theory with the religious fervor that people of the modern world accepted. He said that there would have to be ample, provable scientific evidence within the fossil record over many species of transition transitional species. And you want to know how many of those actually have been found in the fossil record? Exactly a big goose egg. 0. So for the people that just take a look at a practice that an animal happens to be engaging in right now during its evolutionary development, we say that's the way it forever has been, is now, and forever shall be for all time. And actually believe Darwin's theory, this idea of survival of the fittest and survival of the most ruthless, just because we see certain animals engaging in those carnivorous practices today in the modern world, which I've made statements in the past that I do not even necessarily believe that it has always been that way, that animals always were carnivorous in the way that they are today, just because we see them engaged in certain behaviors and practices today. And certainly there is no reason we need to follow an example like that, because we are a higher thought capable being than the animals we're referring to. Just because they're doing it doesn't mean you should follow suit and go and behave like an animal. You're supposedly something a little bit more in consciousness, in evolutionary terms in consciousness, than a base animal. At least we're supposed to be. This idea that man is nothing more than an animal is one of the root ideologies of Satanism. One of the root ideologies of Satanism is man is absolutely indistinct from other animals, completely. And therefore, go ahead and just engage in animal behavior. And if you don't believe me, go look that up. I should know. I was a priest in this religion in my past, so I should know all about it. Better than most people, right? But don't even take my word for it. Go read about it for yourself. Those podcasts were all posted in the 70s in What on Earth is Happening former podcasts. Go back in the early 70s, I believe. Listen to the shows I did on Satanism and Dark Luciferianism. Read those resources. Understand that their mental worldview and ideologies. And that's one of them. That the natural order is kill or be killed, slaughter who you have to slaughter to get your way and to, ensure your way of life. I call this the fundamentally flawed idea of the natural order, which has nothing to do with the actual natural order in nature. 0 to do with it. It's based on a completely erroneous assumption, based on very brief, thin slicing instances of time. And you're making a judgment on what the totality of the natural order actually is. And it has nothing whatever to do with that erroneous perception. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later on the show. The third justification. God gave us dominion over the animals. I love this one. Can't you tell how much I love this one, folks? This is my favorite of them all. God gave us dominion over all the animals, so that means we can murder them and just use them as we please. Yeah, that's God's commandment to us, right? He said, you can go and murder as viciously, violently, and abundantly as you want, as long as you're doing it to animals, not other human beings. Just go and do it to them, because they're completely separate from my creation. You're my favored ones, but them, I don't really care about what you do to them. So just go right ahead. And Christians actually believe this bunk. They actually interpret the Bible in a way that allows for their immoral justifications and their diseased psyches to say, I'm just going to continue this because I interpret that God claimed that this was okay. And they're not even reading their own book. They don't even understand their own book. They don't even understand. They understand the words of the Christ in their own Bible. 0. Less than 0. They have what I call negative knowledge of it. Not only do they have no idea what the actual teachings of the Christ consciousness is all about, but they actually have ascribed things to it which have nothing whatsoever to do with it. And to get back to a 0 point, to a clean slate, would involve themselves digging themselves out of a hole for a long time. I call that the state of negative knowledge. Not only don't you know anything, you've put a whole lot of erroneous beliefs on top of the 0 point. So you have to dig your way back to 0. Just read the book of Genesis, first of all, if you want to even acknowledge this whole notion of, the Bible says, to engage in this kind of practice or not engage in this kind of practice. I think that's a horrible way of judging what's right and wrong, first of all, is that men wrote it in a book and claimed that it was the inspired word of God, and therefore I'm going to just follow that blindly. You need to know, you need to develop true conscience, which is the definitive knowledge of the objective difference between right and wrong. Not have a belief system about what you think is right or think is wrong, and then back it up with man-written words that you're claiming is the divine and inspired word of God. Let me tell you something. The Bible is written by flawed men for the reasons of their own agenda. And yes, they're putting some truths in there, absolutely. Because to have a poison pill be taken by anyone, you need to wrap it in a whole lot of good stuff. Otherwise, you'll smell the poison, you'll taste the poison, and you won't want to take it into yourself. That's how that technique of obfuscation works. That's how that technique of worldview poisoning works. To get the poison in, you have to wrap it up in something that is very good. And I'm not saying that that's always the case, but with the biblical writings and the specific choice of the canon of the Bible and deliberately obfuscating and eliminating and keeping out of the official canon other books that could be said to be as equally quote unquote divinely inspired, this done during Constantine's reign, the Council of Nicaea, do the historical research, they're leaving out a whole lot of other things that say things that are in direct opposition and contrast to what's being said in other books of the Bible. So the Bible's self-contradictory, number one. And I'm not saying there aren't good truths to be found in it. I've talked about them many times on this show. But, let's just give a quote from Genesis that supports the idea that God did no such thing as his claim to give us dominion over the animal kingdom and say we could just use them as our food as we see fit. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 29 and 30, and this is before the fall, in consciousness, before this horrific event took place that plunged man into the mindset of the animal kingdom, really, that led to a diminution in his consciousness and awareness. The words of God are attributed to this following quote, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. Let me just read that again. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. So far, no mention of animals being given to people for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, in other words, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. I'll read that again. To all the beasts of the earth, and birds of the air, and creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. No mention of other animals, even to the other animals. No mention of humans eating other animals, or even animals eating other animals for that matter. Zero mention of those practices. So I would ask the quote-unquote religious people, they're really nothing of the kind. They're the false religious people. That's why I call this the false religion justification, who don't consider suffering as the main guiding point to bring you to the truth of what actions you should or should not take. If it's generating suffering, you shouldn't be doing it. And I have no problem with the terms you should or you should not. That's part of the New Age bunk agenda, to tell you should never point a finger at anyone else and say, you're engaging in something that you should not be. Because why? Oh, that wounds their little precious ego? So you don't want to say anything about it ever? Nonsense. That's another false religion called the New Age movement. Never ever talk about the negative or threaten someone else's belief system. Oh, because the ego reacts, right? Well, you know what? Maybe that's the whole problem. Maybe people aren't speaking enough about the truth and about what's right. And then other people just think, oh, there's hardly any reaction to this. There's hardly any blowback to this. So I'm just going to continue this practice unabated. No one's really calling me out on it. That's the problem, folks. We don't call each other out on our bullshit. That's the problem. This New Age notion of just letting people do all the harm that they want, never say anything to them, never bring up the negative, never call somebody on the things they should not be doing is nonsense. Nonsense. And anybody teaching that is a false spiritual teacher. So I call this argument the false religion justification, because it's coming from these completely erroneous notions of religion and even what their own books have told them. And yeah, you can find contrary things to the quote I just read you out of Genesis. Fine, you're going to find contradiction in the Bible. Want to know why? It's a man-written book. Again, to justify human agendas. And they put a lot of spiritual truths in it so that people would accept it, but also in doing so accept the other stuff that they were throwing in the mix. And if you don't understand that that's what the Bible is, you're very, very naive. Very naive. Or just trapped in that modality of mind control called religion, which we talked about, and you don't even understand the astrotheological underpinnings of world religions. Go back into the earlier shows and pull up the podcasts on astrotheology to look that up, to understand that. So the next argument, the next justification in favor of carnism. Don't worry, this one was killed humanely. Let's think about that. Just think about these words. Killed humanely. I can't figure this one out. Let's try it again. Killed humanely. Yeah. These are complete antitheses of each other. They're diametric opposites. Treating someone humanely does not involve killing them. So these are polar opposite words, and yet you're using them back to back in the same sentence, trying to get them to mean the same thing. I call this, it's not what I call it, it's Orwellian doublespeak. So this is the 1984 doublespeak justification. You could put two diametrically opposing words together and then in your cognitive dissonance attempt to get them to mean the same thing. Killed humanely. Right. Keep believing that, folks. Keep believing that. Because killing is a humane practice. It can be done in a humane way, right? You're taking someone else's life without their consent, but you could do it in a humane way. Keep believing that. Keep lying to yourself, in other words. The next justification is I call this the separation worldview justification. The idea that we're all separate and opposite, and opposing in nature, and, there are beings that think like us, so, then we should treat them like we are, like we want to be treated. But anything that's not like us, this is alien or foreign to us, well, we should treat that with disregard, or that gives us the permission to treat it with disregard. Not necessarily that we should, but if you happen to start treating it with disregard, well, that's okay, because they're not like us. They're not the same as us. The phrase here is, they're not conscious or aware like us, so it's okay to kill them for food. And then people will bring the opposite of this argument in as actually, I've heard this brought up as a justification for continuing to eat meat, saying, well, you eat plants. Plants are a form of life. And we're going to directly address this today. This notion of, well, since plants are a form of life, it's equally as wrong to consume them and make them a part of your diet. And people will actually use that justification and say, well, hey, if you're going to eat plants and it's wrong to eat them, why not just go right ahead and eat animals anyway? And there's no real difference. Well, there is a difference. There is a difference. And if you understand the laws of assimilation, if you really understand the natural laws, the true natural order that does exist here, you would understand, yes, we can, at this point in our evolutionary development, consume plants for our sustenance. I would say at some point when you move to be as evolved that you would not need plants as part of your diet, that the physical vehicle would be so light or so non-physical that you would not need plants, then I would even go and make the statement, now you shouldn't be eating plants. Let them be. If you can live on breath, live on breath. If you can live on light, live on light. And these things are possible. Not everybody is at that point in evolutionary development. I would say the human physiology is at the point of development where we can live without eating animal flesh, dead animal flesh. And I don't even see really there being any point in time where we could not have, where the practice of carnism was necessary. I don't really see there being any time when that was the case, that it was necessary to do what we're doing to animals, that is completely poisoning the field of consciousness and energy in which we're all living. And then finally, the no justification, as I coined it last week, or in other words, the truth, also known as simply the truth. And that is, well, I do feel bad about what I'm doing here, but I could never give up my meat, quote unquote, my meat. You know, it's just way too tasty. It just tastes too good. I'm too addicted to it. I could never develop the willpower to really change who I am and desist in a practice of violence or violence by proxy, which is what carnism is. And those are really the justifications that we use to try to create a right. That's what the word justification means. Creating right, making a wrong into a right. Of course, this is an illusion. It can never be done. It will never be done. It's only an illusion that exists in a diseased psyche that is trying to make a wrong action okay in their own mind, in their own psyche. So we also looked at the law of correspondence last week when it comes to this practice. And the law of correspondence simply states that that which is above is like to that which is below. That which is below is like to that which is above. Or in other words, the universe is self-similar across all scales, across all sizes, and I would suggest modalities of behavior. It is also self-similar, meaning if we continue to create chaos, chaos is going to be generated for us by something that is above us in the real, quote, the real natural order, okay? The universe is going to intelligently rearrange the field of consciousness around us to provide the experience that we have been generating through our behaviors. And it's going to reflect that experience back to us so that we will learn the lesson that, hey, it's not okay to behave like this. We should not be engaging in such practices. And people look at the image that I presented and they think of it like, oh, well, that's just the natural order. Oh, life eats life. And, you know, a little bit, life that's real small gets eaten by something that's bigger, and then that gets eaten by something that's even bigger. No, that's not the natural order. This is the Darwinian notion of the natural order that is a religion that is based on dogmatic religious belief systems. This is not the real natural order. This is not what nature does. This is chaos. This is the state of chaos. It's the exact opposite of order. Things, everything eating everything else. That's chaos, ladies and gentlemen. And that's chaos that we have created by not saying no to this condition. This is a condition. It's not the natural order. It's not nature. There's a difference between the human condition and human nature. We've talked about that ad infinitum on past shows. In natural law, when people say, well, animals eat other animals, so why shouldn't humans do it? It seems like it's natural. Human beings because of the complexity and the different nature, the higher nature of their consciousness and their ability to think and reason and comprehend and delve into the laws of nature and understand them. So their ability to reason and understand ultimately holds a human being to a higher standard when it comes to moral law than animals are held. Now, that isn't to say that when an animal, eats another animal, that's wrong for them. We are held to a higher standard because of our higher consciousness. So natural law is going to have an effect upon us for doing that. There is also another consideration to take into account when it comes to this, and something that has been hinted at in ancient writings, that it is very possible that perhaps even in the quite ancient past, or maybe even not in the so distant ancient past, but in the near ancient past, that this even was not always the case for animals. People believe in this linear progression, that species cannot fall from a place that they once were, from a higher place they once were. We have this erroneous notion through archaeology and anthropology and other sciences who haven't really seen the full picture in scope about how cycles of time work, okay? And people think we're moving in a linear progression from less advanced to more advanced, and nothing could be further from the truth. We have seen higher places of our civilization, we have seen lower, and time moves in cyclical progressions that are not, we're not bound to those cycles, but they are tendencies, and our choices will ultimately determine what we experience as a result of those tendencies and how we react to those ebbs and flows in time, of those cycles of time. There is a high degree of probability and a lot of evidence through some ancient records that animals were not even always at the base level of consciousness that they were at, and perhaps did not engage in the types of practices that they engage in what we call the natural kingdom, at some past moment in time. So animals may not even have always been like this. We're looking at their current condition and just accepting the notion just because we see it like this, and for as long as we've been paying attention or keeping records in the modern world, believe it has always been like this, and therefore that is how it always should be. Again, this directly relates with worldview. What you believe we are or are capable of becoming. And I talked about one of the defenses for carnism, or justifications for it, as the we are argument. And you'll hear people saying this all the time. We are hunter-gatherers. That's what human beings are. No, that's a condition that human beings were experiencing, and actually really even aren't experiencing that except in isolated pockets of the world today. We are not anything. We can be what we want to create ourselves into. Other than the makers of right and wrong, we can basically be anything we want. That's not, man cannot ever make that. But man can evolve and not be bound to certain practices or ways of being in the world that he may have once bound himself into, or environmental conditions may have temporarily bound him to engage in. We are not anything. That's the whole thing to keep in mind here. That's the worldview. If you're stuck in the worldview that the current condition is eternal, you might as well hang up your hat now and walk out and give up. And why bother saying a word, talking to anybody, trying to affect any change? Accept your situation, because right now you're a prisoner. So could we say human beings are prisoners and that's just eternal and you must accept that and be like that forever? No, it's ridiculous. It's nonsense. You have a choice. Choice is what's keeping us in the prison of our own design, of our own making. We can choose something different if enough of us want it. The same is true when it comes to what we call nature. What most people are calling human nature has nothing whatsoever to do with what the real essence of humanity is. It's the current condition that they are attached to and identified with and think can never be changed. They think that it just always was, is now, always will be, and it has to be accepted. And that is a poisoned worldview, attitude, and way of looking at the world. So I don't even look at it as animals have always been like this. I think animals were once at a higher level of consciousness and didn't do this to each other. How about that?